They're now letting you know, secret 9/11 memo reveals Bush was rewriting the history of 9/11 attacks on the warnings he'd tuned out. And the warnings he'd tuned out. Wait a minute. George Bush lied about 9/11? Get out. You guys. Come on. On April 29, 2004, President George W. Bush hosted one of the most unusual meetings to ever take place inside the Oval Office. The 10 members of the 9/11 Commission got to ask him and Vice President Dick Cheney any question they wanted about the September 11th attacks. The words that were spoken in that room remained secret for nearly 2 decades. Now we can finally read what Bush said. Earlier this month, after more than 18 years, the government declassified a 31-page memorandum for the record, which compiles notes that the commissioners took during the meeting. Now, if you remember, George Bush would not testify in front of that committee without Dick Cheney next to him and without it being secret. And we let that happen. Well, you know why? Because our media is bought by the military-industrial complex, which wanted a war in Iraq.
And even still, the 9/11 Commission in the report was like the only report produced by the federal government that was like more flawed and politically manipulated than the JFK assassination.
They all denounced it. Didn't every member of the fucking committee denounce the thing?
Yeah.
The document shows the commissioners giving Bush multiple chances to acknowledge the numerous documented warnings he'd received from his own government of impending attacks by al-Qaeda. For the most part, Bush failed to do so. Instead, he passed the buck. Perhaps the largest of Bush's evasions that day concerned his CIA director, George Tenet. The threat was overseas. That was what George said. Bush's implication at the time is clear. He wanted the commission, and by extension the public, to think that no one could have anticipated al-Qaeda mounting a large-scale attack on U.S. soil. But in fact, Tenet's CIA had warned Bush more than once that al-Qaeda could strike anywhere at any time, and that all U.S. citizens were potential targets. The most notorious warnings that Bush received, but not the only one, was a CIA briefing headline. The headline was, "Bin Laden determined to strike the U.S." Very little of Bush's excuse-making and clumsy attempts to rewrite history found their way into the 9/11 Commission's report. Really? Indeed, one of the commissioners, Richard Ben Venesti, told Insider he still had questions today about what Bush knew and when. I could never square in my mind CIA Director Tenet's intense preoccupation with the al-Qaeda threat in the months leading up to 9/11 with his claim that he never briefed President Bush on the many clues the intelligence community had developed that bin Laden was planning to launch a spectacular attack on the U.S. homeland, Benaviste said. The commissioner's reports approach to the commission report's approach to the mystery is to make the apparent disconnect between CIA and the Oval Office sound like something out of a Greek tragedy. No one working on these late al-Qaeda leads in the summer of 2001 connected them to the high level of threat reporting. No analytic work foresaw the lightning that could connect the thundercloud to the ground. What the new memo makes clear is that the White House's lack of urgency in facing down the domestic al-Qaeda threat wasn't all that complicated. Tenet, the record shows, did everything he could to get Bush to focus on al-Qaeda. Bush just wasn't interested. If you want to understand how Bush escaped blame for 9/11, winning a second term despite having presided over one of the gravest and most costly failures in presidential history, you need to understand exactly what happened that day in the Oval Office almost 20 years ago. The White House had negotiated for the joint meeting where Bush and Cheney would sit and answer questions together. But Bush didn't lean too heavily on this accommodation. The president was well briefed and answered our questions fully. One of the 9/11 commissioners, Governor Thomas H. Keene of New Jersey, told Insider, the president's demeanor throughout was relaxed, notes the memo. He answered questions without notes. 2 weeks before the committee's Oval Office meeting, the commission had heard from Tenet. His public testimony raised more questions than it answered, especially about what Bush knew and when. In the spring and summer of 2001, Tenet had warned Bush no fewer than 40 separate times that a major attack by al-Qaeda was on the horizon. Analysts called the flood of warnings a threat spike and the summer of threat. Nevertheless, Bush chose to spend most of August at his ranch in Crawford, Texas, on a working vacation. Shortly after arriving on August 6th, he'd received the detailed president's daily brief from the CIA with its direct warning that bin Laden intended to strike inside the U.S. By 2004, after the PDB became public, commentators were taking seriously the possibility that Bush had one job, keep the country safe, and that he failed to do it. If only Osama had faxed an X marks the spot map to the Crawford Ranch showing the Pentagon, the Capitol, the Twin Towers, and the word boom scrawled in Arabic, wrote Maureen Dowd in the New York Times opinion columnist at the time, that might have sparked sluggish imaginations, or maybe not. Fortunately for Bush, the 9/11 Commission report was careful not to point the finger directly at the sitting president. While the report acknowledges that the August 6th president's daily briefing headlined bin Laden determined to strike in the United States, it states unequivocally that there is no indication of any further discussion by Bush and his team regarding a domestic terror attack. Reading the commission's report, one can see a torrent of warnings coming out of the CIA and a sense of growing alarm among Bush's counterterrorism team. But the failure of those loud and repeated warnings to reach Bush's brain is attributed mainly to institutional problems, issues with imagination, policy, capabilities, and management. Unlike Dowd, the commission chose not to question Bush's competence. We chose not to assign individual responsibility for the failure to prevent 9/11. Benaviste, the former commissioner of 9/11 commissioner, said, but rather to lay out the facts we had uncovered and allow the public and ultimately history to make judgments based on the factual record. Not the commission assigned to do so. No. On the question of pre-9/11 warnings, Bush stuck to a few points. First, according to Bush, the al-Qaeda threat, as was presented to him, was almost exclusively overseas. Second, the extent that al-Qaeda posed a threat to the U.S. soil, Bush says that no one told him how, when, or where it would strike. There was, in his view, no actionable intelligence, not about Osama bin Laden, not about al-Qaeda personnel on U.S. soil. The August 6th briefing about bin Laden's intentions, he said, was historical in nature. Other than that, Bush claimed he had never been informed about the potential for an attack on the U.S. There was no such actionable intelligence on such a threat, he told the commission. Not one. Third, Bush didn't think it was productive to assign responsibility for pre-9/11 failures to individuals. It should not be about blaming people, he said, because, yeah, you'd be blamed. That's why. The country was ill-served by playing the blame game. The president didn't see much point in assigning personal blame for 9/11. Nobody wants to see something like this happen. They would have moved heaven and earth to stop it. Bush's repeated insistence that he was never informed of a specific threat on U.S. soil will be hard to take seriously by anyone who has read the August 6th presidential daily briefing. Bush told the commission that the PDB was historical in nature. A few weeks after the 9/11 attacks, Bush paid a visit to the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA. He walked through the corridors, making small talk and shaking hands. "Go get him," someone shouted to Bush, according to a former CIA employee who was there at the time. Bush looked stunned for a moment, then came his reply, "That's your job." Wow. I don't think anybody could have predicted that these people would take an airplane and slam it into the World Trade Center. Even in retrospect, there was nothing to suggest this. So that's called a professional liar and a war criminal. Mm-hmm. And she is the dregs of humanity, just like George Bush and Dick Cheney and everybody else in that administration. There is no one that she is a moral superior to. No one. Alex Jones, she's killed way more people. Alex Jones didn't start a torture program. She did. And she's lying. Here's George Bush.
We must stop the terror. I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive. All right, you need another.
Nice follow through.
You know what? As it relates to my brother, there's one thing I know for sure. He kept us safe.
They just say it. They just say it. And Chris Christie.
Look, I'm happy that the passports survived the jet fuel, so we know exactly what happened on 9/11 and at World Trade Center, Tower 7, and at the Pentagon. We know exactly what happened.
They found the hijackers' passports.
We have all the answers.
So we know everything. And Building 7 got no questions. None.
Pentagon, no questions.
I'm sure it happened exactly the way they said it. And just like with the vaccines or COVID policy or anything, if you question that, you're a white supremacist, Nazi bad person.
Of course, if you look at the World Economic Forum's website, they have a very clear minute-by-minute breakdown as to what happened on 9/11 that tells you the truth. No one should question that.
Tip of the hat for George Bush. The guy got to give it to him.
You know what? As it relates to my brother, there's one thing I know for sure. He kept us safe.
He knows that for sure. There's one thing I know for sure. Is cigarettes don't cause cancer. There's one thing I know for sure. No, please don't take that at face value. That's a joke. That is not. I'm not giving out medical misinformation. That is a joke. Hey, we're doing live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles, December 9th, 16th, 23rd, and 30th. And we're going to be in Tempe, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Nashville. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets. See you there.